Regley sighed as he tapped on his tablet. For all his years of experience managing relief kitchens, the GCAW operation strained him to his limits. The Confederacy Relief Command had never seen an operation as large as the aftermath of the GCAW Incursion War. Normally used to local disaster relief, Relief Command was now tasked with supplying needed support for the population of 3 planets. Regley was a relief kitchen manager who prided himself on a well-run operation. Now, he wondered if it was possible to successfully manage his piece of the rebuilding process. Regley was initially irritated he was being deployed to help rebuild and reconstruct the GCAW worlds after the end of the conflict. He, like most of the Confederacy, saw the body of the GCAW leader as it was carted out of what was arrogantly called the Grand Palace of the Gods, a massive, gaudy structure. His body was so obese his feathers weren't long enough to obscure the skin beneath. When the Confederacy gained a foothold on the GCAW homeworld after a brazen infiltration by a Special Forces team, the world quickly fell to the Confederacy's superior numbers and tactics. Seeing the writing on the wall, the GCAW leader took the easy way out and swallowed a potent neurotoxin. Like most of the Confederacy, Regley held deep animosity toward the GCAW as a whole. The most common interaction any of the Confederate species had with them were with roving pirates. There was a persistent belief during the year-long conflict the GCAW were supportive of the invasion. The belief was born of the assumption the name GCAW Democratic People's Republic meant something. The species of the Confederacy had operated as a representative republic for so long that they assumed everyone else did as well. Then, the images of the GCAW homeworld started filtering through the press. Regley was, like most of the galaxy, aware of the escapees found in a shipping container. Seeing the true extent of the conditions the average GCAW lived under hit everyone hard. Beyond the palace and its bureaucratic sector were kilometers upon kilometers of shanties. The common GCAW citizen lived in squalid conditions without running water or electricity. The spaceports, space elevators, and opulent entertainment districts built to cater to the military caste stood in stark contrast to a people that would have been listed on the no-contact list because of how primitive they lived. There were even cases of GCAW living directly in factories, sleeping in shifts next to machinery to limit downtime. Regley was stationed in one such factory town, situated next to a large freshwater marshland. There were thousands of towns and villages spread across the planet, and many more on the other 2 worlds. Normally, disaster relief was not a difficult process. Arrive with temporary facilities, keep people fed and housed, help rebuild, and the job was done. The GCAWs were different. The vast population of GCAWs were effectively slaves. They were tasked with performing the menial labor of society to keep the military caste fed. While they knew how to operate the machinery, the more complex tasks were held within the military caste. The GCAWs didn't know how to transport materials, manage production schedules, or maintain the equipment. To them, stuff came in. A button was pressed and stuff came out. The Confederacy knew they couldn't leave the GCAW alone to rebuild society on their own. History was littered with ancient nations formed on the back of slave rebellions. None of them turned out well. Vast famine would wipe out the GCAWs living outside agricultural centers, while criminal gangs would form and fragment society. Leaving the GCAWs to their own devices would end up threatening the wider galaxy with spillover from their societal collapse, with unsustainable refugees and gang violence, until the Confederacy could build up the internal institutions and knowledge necessary to run a complex society. Relief Command had to pick up the slack to keep the population healthy. While Relief Command had experience with running logistics, it had never done so on a multi-planet scale. Difficulties were compounded by the fact the GCAW population was horribly malnourished. The only solace, if it could even be called, that was wartime famine had killed nearly 2/3 of the GCAW underclass. The factory town Regley was assigned to feed had estimated dwelling space for 10,000 residents. His daily requirements were to feed 3,200. He had to do so with the shipments Relief Command could muster. He stared again at the tablet. It was a manifest for his next shipment: flour, salt, protein powder, and supplemental vitamin powder. It was coming in on a private contracted freighter called the Crooked Weasel. Since space was at a premium, Relief Command only shipped bulk dry goods. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to channel so far. All they were missing was proper meat and vegetables to round out the diet. Regley's kitchen was otherwise operating on water pumped and purified from the surrounding marshlands. The poor ingredient selection weighed on everyone. While nutritionally balanced, the bland thin wafers his kitchen produced impacted morale. Not just on the GCAs the kitchen supported, but the staff as well. Over 6 weeks of operation, he had already turned his entire volunteer staff over twice. Regley was equally sick of daily wafers, yet it was all they could afford to ship and cook. He didn't have the luxury of quitting like the volunteer line cooks. Worse, the poor food quality led to a similar turnover rate in volunteers and other relief workers since they also had to eat the same fare. He sighed again and prepared to look at the next task. Aboard the Crooked Weasel were more volunteers. To cycle through. He wondered why he even bothered learning their names. They would most likely abandon the post in the following week's shipment. Before he could look at the list, he heard a brief rap at his office door before a haggard Varric plunged her orange Phalid face into the room. Regley couldn't remember her name and didn't bother to, since she had already indicated she was shipping out when the freighter arrived. "Sir, we have a problem in the storage facility." Regley groaned. Another issue with constantly cycling. Volunteers was, when the same problem cropped up again, he had to personally oversee it. It wasn't fair to get angry at the young woman. She hadn't experienced the issue Regley knew was happening and had no idea how to resolve it. "Come on," Regley grunted as he stood. The pair made their way to the storage warehouse attached to the back of the kitchen building. Inside, the room was mostly empty with only a handful of crates. The kitchen was barely getting by between shipments and couldn't afford waste. The Varric pointed a small clawed finger at a corner of the room. The tarp wall of the warehouse had been torn open, and next to a crate were 2 ugly crustacean animals. Measuring 20 centimeters long, the crustaceans had a pair of small claws attached to long, deep red-shelled bodies. 8 clattering legs propelled them, while a pair of long stalks waved around in the air. They were testing a protein powder crate. For openings, they were a local pest that lived out in the marshlands. Despite the claws, the bug-looking crustaceans were harmless. Well, as harmless as pests that wanted to eat their stock of ingredients could be. Come now, they won't hurt you. Just take care of them, Regley said with irritation as he waved a hand in the direction of the pests. The Varric looked at Regley with worry and walked over to the creatures. Regley's own worry spiked when he saw her lift a boot, and before he could shout to stop her, she stomped down. The boot crushed the outer chitin, and from within, a disgusting tan goop oozed out. Regley ran a hand over his long muzzle and growled, which was aimed at himself. He had dealt with the animals so frequently he had forgotten to inform the Varric not to squish them since it made a big mess. He walked over and picked the other one up by the back of the shell. The crustacean wiggled its legs and claws helplessly. In the air, Regley then vented his frustration with the volunteer. "Not that it matters, since you're abandoning us in a few hours, but this is how we get rid of them. Clean up the mess before you go." Regley knew his words were unfair as he walked out of the room, leaving the crestfallen Varric behind. More anger grew in him as he cursed his lack of sensitivity. He was allowing his frustrations with falling behind on keeping the GCAs. Fed affect him as he was now lashing out at subordinates. As he marched to the edge of the marshland near the purification pump, he reared the crustacean back and heaved it deep into the trees growing up through the water. The loud splash briefly paused the cacophony from the various animals that made the region home. Taking a few moments to listen as the noise slowly returned, Regley centered his thoughts. He needed to return to his office to memorize the names and faces of the newest recruits. Even though he knew they wouldn't last a week or two, it would be rude to not give them a proper welcome. They were volunteering for the post after all. Back. In his office, he flicked through the faces and names. As he moved to the final of the 6 new volunteers, he paused. It was a face of a race he hadn't interacted with before, and only knew by reputation. A human Regley had a negative view of the humans. Everything he had heard about them indicated they were as volatile and unpredictable as a Death World species would be. They had crashed a moon into a planet and accidentally damaged a space station in recent years. While he fully respected them as a species, a human posthumously received the Pulsar Order for his role in breaking the siege of the GCAW homeworld. He wasn't sure if he wanted a species around that was able to single-handedly defeat over 100 GCAW soldiers. Another reason was personal. Humans had, according to some news report, taken a liking to Regley's people, the Berrigans. There had been a dozen marriages in the last decade between the 2 species, and it was confirmed the 2 were genetically compatible. However, Regley bristled at the nickname the humans had given the Berrigans, fluffy puppers. Even though the spouses reported it was a term of endearment, Regley had interpreted it as the humans lording their superior Deathworlder status over the rest of the galaxy. He looked at the human's profile more closely. The human was a male named Creeford Doucet. He had to press the speaker icon to know how to properly pronounce it since the spelling was unusual. He hailed from a region of Earth called Louisiana, specifically the city of New Orleans. Like most volunteers, Creeford was a young man. Most youth look to volunteer activity after finishing a university education before entering the proper workforce. He recently graduated from a place called Tulane University with a degree in something called food sciences. Regley had heard the humans do bizarre things to their food. Knowing what human scientists were capable of, he became worried what they'd need a scientist dedicated to food for. Food was food. You put it over some fire to kill the microbes and then you ate it. He hoped Creeford wasn't some odd human who would end up turning a piece of fruit into a deadly weapon. His mind suddenly shifted to the absurdity of possibly needing a defense course on how to address being attacked in a dingy alley with someone armed with produce. Scrolling back to the top of the profile, Regley looked at the man's photo. On it was a youthful face with skin colored like fired pottery and brown eyes. He had short-cut, messy black hair, which appeared to be intentionally styled as such. His face had an easy, friendly demeanor. Of course, it was likely Regley's biases in play since he had no experience with human facial expressions. For all he knew, that's what they looked like when they were plotting their latest ridiculous schemes. A buzz on his intercom pulled him away from the tablet. It was the signal for an incoming transmission. The intercom speaker activated, and a feminine voice Regley placed as Synapian came through. "This is the Crooked Weasel requesting permission to land." Regley checked the manifest to verify. The ship name and confirmed the secondary transponder code matched the document. They had to be careful in this sector of space, since there were still a few GCOM military remnants engaging in an insurgency. Thankfully, everything matched. Permission. Granted. "Please set down on Pad 1, Regley replied before standing up to meet the ship. The ship, a typical Class A private freighter used by small shipping firms, gently touched down on the landing pad. Just outside the pad waited the 6 volunteers. With their personal effects, including the Varric with one boot that looked substantially cleaner than the other. The 6 turned their eyes to the ground when Regley approached. After the engines disengaged, the cargo door opened on the ship and lowered a ramp. The 6 departing volunteers began to move to the ship. "Just wait there! You'll only get in the way!" Regley snapped at them. They stopped and, with embarrassment in their eyes, went back to sit with their belongings. Regley knew they meant no harm. They intended to help unload the freighter for the last time, but Regley couldn't emotionally handle it. Half of him was upset the traders were abandoning their post, and the other half of him was jealous he couldn't go with them. Aboard the ship, the 5 of new volunteers were helping move hover pads down the ramp as they unloaded the provision crates. Regley quickly identified Creeford since he was carrying a crate on his shoulder, like it was nothing, along with another human who was dressed like a member of the crew. As they unloaded the ship, a female Synapian in a matching uniform to the human stepped down the ramp. Strapped on her chest was a sleeping infant with an unusual scale pattern across his shoulders that was interrupted by patches of peach-colored skin. Regley, upon seeing the child, recalled a small news story about the first confirmed human-Synapian pairing. He was now looking at the first human-Synapian hybrid in the universe. The Synapian approached Regley and, after peering at the sky, said, "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Regley replied. He gestured at the infant. "Never thought I'd end up seeing the first one. He's adorable." The Synapian's head crest fluttered with happiness. "Isn't he? He's been good so far. Barely cries if he's been fed. He can be a demon when he's hungry, though." Which already did most of the lifting with its mass, then it wasn't a small ship in the void. After everyone left their personal effects in their new quarters, Regley led them to the large kitchen space attached to the mess hall facility. Inside was a long space with 8 identical stations. The stations contained a vast array of equipment a commercial kitchen would need. Burners, ovens, mixers, and various implements and tools were available for use. Unfortunately, with the ingredient limitations they had at their disposal, the standard module kitchen was overboard. The volunteers only ever followed a simple recipe: sheet, used stand mixers, preformed pans, and the large ovens. "Here is your workstation. We are currently serving 2 meals per day, one at noon and one in the evening. Our work schedules begin in the morning for prep, and we finish in the evening, after final service. Unfortunately, due to the extensive needs on GCAW, we are pulling cooking and serving duties. The auto washers are designed to handle industrial grime, so don't waste time scrubbing. Just toss your gear in the washer and it'll do the rest. Follow the instructions and you'll do fine, Regley said. He looked around, and apart from Creeford's "yes, chef" reply, everyone was silent. It's a simple job. Follow the instructions at your workstation and you'll do fine, Regley continued. He then led them into the mess hall. Here, you'll serve the residents of town. Hand out one ration and move on to the next. The previous volunteers, prior to leaving, had already completed the evening meal preparation. It was useful to show the new volunteers that, despite the numbers, the 7 of them could easily handle the volume. The recruits stared out in awe over the large canvas, open, air tent and its long rows of bench-style tables. A warm, humid breeze blew through the tent from the marshlands outside. The size of the room could be overwhelming to anyone who didn't have a background in the catering business prior to volunteering for relief operations. Regley looked at the new volunteers and noticed that Creeford was once again the outlier. Instead of looking at the tent, he was staring at one of the racks loaded with ration wafers. His face had a sad look on it as he regarded the food they would serve in an hour. Regley sighed. If he was already this depressed seeing the food, it would be even worse when he saw who was eating it. Regley had the volunteers familiarize themselves with their workstations until the serving period started. That's when the true gravity of their efforts would set in. At the line, Regley, the volunteers, and a dozen rotating training corps members prepared to hand out the evening rations. Then the GCAWs started to file in. Silent, heads down. And haggard, the GCAWs were every definition of broken. They were conditioned from birth to be slaves and only ever had the expectation they existed to work, reproduce, and die. Few of them even saw their own offspring, who were kept in communal nurseries and raised by a military adjunct. As each came by, they handled their bland ration wafer with great reverence. The typical Confederacy species didn't comprehend the concept of starvation. Sure, a few would grumble if the day was too busy, and they forgot to eat lunch. But true grinding starvation was a thing of the past. To the GCAWs, it was daily life. To have 2 bland nutrient wafers was, to them, a godsend. Even still, the mood of the tent was somber. The GCAWs only whispered low to one another, leaving a dour feel over the room. After they left, the various support personnel and other volunteers assigned to bringing the village back from the brink came in, and the mood was even worse. Not only were they fighting a difficult battle rehabilitating the GCAWs, they had to do so with terrible food that the different species needed to dip in water to properly consume. Finally, it was the kitchen staff's turn to eat. Regley looked around at his team as their reality sunk in. This terrible wafer would be their sole form of sustenance while on the planet, and they would have to look in the eye of thousands of downtrodden people as well. Creeford once more had a different expression. He slowly chewed the wafer, and between bites, peered at it with a look of sadness in his eyes. Regley thought he saw something deeper than realization. He had to live off the food in Creeford's eyes. Afterward, Regley assisted with sending the wafer racks through the cleaning machine and dismissed everyone for the evening. Creeford, instead of leaving to enjoy the remaining daylight, approached Regley. "Chef, I wish to prep for tomorrow." Regley, exhausted from the day, shrugged. "Have at it, Creeford." What could the human do? It was a simple recipe, and he'd quickly find out that it didn't make much sense to prepare the goop now or in the morning. The next morning, Regley went by each of the volunteer quarters around 0900 to prepare for the midday meal. His hackles started to rise when one of the members, Creeford, refused to open his door. The ringing of the communicator pad and pounding on the door was met with silence. He sighed when he realized the human must have already been broken. After getting the midday meal done, he would need to send out a request for a new volunteer. Leading the group to the kitchen, Regley opened the door and was immediately hit with an unusual and pleasant aroma. An appealing odor hung in the air as he looked in. The lights were already on, and the sound of a stand mixer whirring filled the air. About halfway down in the kitchen, at his assigned station, Creeford was already at work. After sending the other 5 to their stations, Regley approached Creeford. His oven was baking a batch of wafers, and he had multiple racks set aside under covers. The stand mixer was spinning rapidly as Creeford observed the process. Regley peered at the finished wafers on the cooling rack. No, not wafers. What he saw was 4 times as thick as a wafer. The top had a cross etched into the thick flour brick, and the food bulged out of the preformed squares in the pan. Fury rose in Regle when he saw the rations. The idiot human had used far more ingredients than were required. Was he not aware they were barely able to feed everyone with their supply allocation? "Creeford!" Regle shouted. "What is this?" Creford turned, leaving the stand mixer to spin. "Good morning, chef. I woke early to get prepped for the evening meal. I'm also going to fit in some time for tomorrow's meal so I can free up extra time in the evenings." "No!" Regle growled as he pointed to the thick flour bricks. "What is that?" "The instructions clearly tell you the quantities of ingredients you need in each batch. Just mix it up, pour it into the molds, and send it in the oven." "How can you not follow simple instructions?" Creeford stared for a few moments in thought. "Well," Regle said when the human didn't respond immediately. "Sorry, chef," Creeford said. "I need to think about my response. We use a lot of terms from my parts that most don't understand, so I need to be sure of what I say first." "Spit it out then," Regle said with annoyance. "Well, chef, I used the prescribed ingredients. Well, I used a little less water, but that's because the recipe made it too soupy." "That's why they come out so hard," Creeford explained. "Do you take me for a fool?" "I can clearly see yours are at least 5 times bigger," Regle said with a jab of his finger. Creeford turned his head and frowned. "I don't follow. How does it looking bigger mean I used more ingredients?" Regle's annoyance grew. He marched over to the digital scale on the counter and turned it on. The scale was zeroed in at a proper weighted wafer to ensure the process was being followed. "Put one on there, and I'll show you." Creeford shrugged, picked up one of his wafers, and put it on the scale. To Regle's surprise, the scale read slightly less than 0. Despite its appearance, it was slightly lighter than a normal wafter. He felt his jaw hang open. "What? How is this possible?" "If it pleases the chef," Creeford began with a gesture of his hand. "Pick one of them up and give it a squeeze." Regle picked up the oddly light wafer and squeezed it. Instead of snapping like he expected, he heard a gentle crackling sound as the object compressed in his hand. Despite the hardened exterior, the interior was as fluffy as a pillow. When he released, the object expanded back to its original shape. The only evidence it was squeezed was the cracking on the exterior shell. "What in blazes is this?" Regle said in surprise. "Basic bread, chef," Creeford said. "It's the best I can do with our ingredient list. I'd be able to do better with some yeast and a little sugar." Regle looked back down at the item in his hand. He squeezed. Again, and this time, pulled it. The bread, as Creeford called it, easily pulled apart with a small, pleasant gust of steam tickling his nose. The interior was soft and pliable. He noticed the softness was a result of small air bubbles that formed inside, making an unusual structural pattern inside. "Have a taste," Creeford said. Regle placed some in his mouth. The flavor almost floored him. He wasn't sure if it was weeks of bland nutrient wafers or if the bread was legitimately amazing, but it was a flavor he enjoyed substantially. Creeford had somehow taken the exact same disgusting survival flour and created a food item that was actually worth eating. How? Creeford turned off his stand mixer. "Well, chef, we just need to put a little less water in the mix and let the mixer work until it forms this sticky dough." He pulled the paddle off the mixer and extracted a sticky tan wad from it. "If we had a proper bread hook, it would make it even easier." Creeford then took the wad and, using a knife, cut it into small pieces that he placed in the center of the pan. He then cut a cross into the top of the bread. "Now just bake it a little less than the wafer and you get a nice fluffy loaf. Honestly, what you have there isn't as good. The stuff I'm prepping for tomorrow will have had more time to rise, so it will be even better." Regle was shocked. "What made you think of doing this?" Creeford shrugged. "When I saw the wafers yesterday, the ingredients were crying out in sadness." "What?" "The food's soul, chef. It was broken and sad. It's happier now, but I still have a lot more to work with to bring out the joy," Creeford said. Regle didn't know how to respond to that. This human had an odd religious belief to think food had a soul. Still, what he did was amazing, and it would greatly help their cause. The bread was a big surprise for the few Jicka that received one instead of the usual nutrient wafer. A minor argument broke out over who would be the lucky ones to get the new food. Unfortunately, there wasn't time for everyone to prep the new bread for the evening meal, so the same argument commenced then. However, by the next day, everyone was getting the new bread. One simple change to the process, and Creeford single-handedly stabilized the volunteer situation in the camp. Regley was so impressed, he reported it to command where it filtered down. Elsewhere, Regley knew, however, that it was a temporary fix. Even if the bread was palatable, they'd eventually start growing sick of eating it every meal. Creeford proved to be, in other ways, an unusual individual. Since he had completed his tasks well before evening meal service, he would spend his evenings going out into the marshland. Regley and other volunteers would observe him bringing back an unusual array of plants and small animals from the marshlands and disappearing into his quarters. A few days after that, unusual smells started to waft from his quarters. The same day the first smells were reported, Creeford began skipping his evening bread ration. No one was sure how he was able to maintain his strength on only one ration a day. Not even humans could go long periods of time eating nothing. After 2 weeks of this, Regley decided to talk to the human. When he approached Creeford's door, he could smell the rich aromas coming from within. He knocked. After a moment, the door opened and Creeford's face peeked out. "Evening, chef. What brings you by?" Creeford, "I'm concerned about you. You haven't been eating your evening ration." "Are you feeling sick?" Regley asked. Creeford laughed. "Oh, nah, I just found better eats." Regley felt himself stumble a bit in shock. "Better eats? Where?" Creeford laughed again. "Hold on, I'll show you." He reached over and deactivated the gravity field before welcoming Regley into the quarters. The aromas inside only grew. In the kitchen, a large pot bubbled on a burner, while a smaller one hissed and crackled. In a different part of the living space, an array of unusual steel machines were lined against a wall. Creeford strode over to the smaller pot and pulled out a metal wire mesh basket. In the basket, a smaller piece of bread sizzled. Moving the bread to a plate, he took a white powdery substance and dusted the top. He then handed it to Regley. "Here, careful, it's still hot." Regley took the plate. "You eat this?" Creeford nodded. Regley gingerly touched the item and tested the warmth. It had cooled enough to pick up and take a bite. When he did, an incredibly sweet flavor exploded in his mouth. It was heaven. He quickly chewed the rest of the concoction. "What is this?" "It's a beignet. Deep-fried sweet dough with a dusting of powdered sugar," Creeford said with a smile. Regley, "Put the plate down." "Okay, that's good. What's in it, and where did you get it? I know you didn't whip this up with some protein powder." "I've been exploring the marshlands. I found a plant that produces a great vegetable oil and another that has natural sugars," Creeford explained. Regley suddenly felt ill. "And you just fed me this? Isn't that dangerous?" "Nah," Creeford said as he gestured to the equipment against the wall. "I made sure to test it extensively for toxins. Between my food science degree and upbringing, identifying good." "Food is simple," Regley blinked. "So the humans could deploy science for something more than insane stunts." "Can you bring this to the menu?" Creeford's face fell to a frown. "Unfortunately, getting oil and sugar from the marsh isn't something I can scale." He gestured to the pot. "This, however, is my next experiment." Regley peered inside the pot. A number of unusual ingredients were floating inside a bubbling red liquid. Rich aromas wafted from within. "Can I try this?" "Oh no, chef," Creeford said. "Not that I'm trying to keep it to myself. Problem is, I'm still working on the spices. Cajun seasoning uses spices with capsaicin in it. I'm still trying to pull it out without losing the flavor." "What is capsaicin?" Regley asked. "A chemical that gives cooking a little kick. Problem is, it's a nasty irritant to other species. So we tend to not share it," Creeford explained. Regley stood staring at the pot once more. "Shame, it looks good. Anyway, keep at it." Regley heard Creeford's snappy, "Yes, chef," as he left the quarters. A few more weeks passed, and Regley ended up facing down a crisis. Staring at his communicator pad, he saw a notice that his next shipment would be missed due to a mix-up in the manifests. That left him scraping the barrel with his materials. It then got worse. "Sir," one of his volunteers shouted as he poked his head in the room. "We have a problem in the warehouse." Regley groaned. "It must be those damned red bugs again. Come on, and whatever you do, don't step on any." The pair went to the warehouse, and Regley's eyes bugged out of his head. Instead of one or two testing a crate, there were dozens of the things. They had successfully pulled open a protein powder crate and had spread the contents all over. "The ground! No!" Regley shouted. "Quick, get the other volunteers. We need to clean this out fast. Regley started picking up the creatures 2 at a time and prepared to throw them back into the marsh. As he did, the other volunteers sprinted over. Regley shouted, "Get them out before they eat our stock! We'll starve otherwise!" Instead of running the creatures by twos to the marsh, the volunteers threw them out of the tent into the open space. However, the damage was done. The protein crate had been damaged and the contents either eaten or contaminated on the ground. Regley felt deflated as he sat among the dozens of red crustaceans slowly scuttling around. "Everyone, this is bad. We're going to have to find a way to stretch flour until our next shipment arrives in a couple weeks." Everyone's mood instantly plummeted, save Creeford, who picked up one of the crustaceans. "Chef, I don't think we have a problem. These here ecrevis are good eats." "Ah, Cree, what?" Regley said, irritating flaring at Creeford's calm demeanor in the face of the crisis. "Crawdads," Creeford explained, as if that would make things any clearer. "They're a bit bigger, but they're similar to what we got back in the bayou. I tested a few out a while back, and they're quite tasty." "You want us to eat these disgusting bugs?" another volunteer blurted out. Creeford snorted. "They're not disgusting. Chef, with your permission, I've fixed the seasoning issue. It doesn't have the same kick, but the flavor is there. It's time to bring out the soul in the ingredients." Regley waved him off. Creeford must be nuts if he could save them with insects, but it wouldn't hurt to let the humans show them. The human returned with a small bag, a jug of oil, and a metal pot. He went into the storage tent and returned with flour. After pouring the flour into the pot, he added the oil and turned the heat on. Everyone watched in fascination as he mixed the flour and oil in the bottom. It turned a deep brown color, and then he added water to the pot. Afterward, he upended the sack, and a red powder poured out into the mixture. When the pot came to a boil, he picked up 2 of the crustaceans and dropped them in. They squirmed from the heat before going still. After some time boiling away, Creeford used some tongs and extracted one of the creatures. He used a small mallet to crack open the body, and instead of a disgusting goo, a slightly red-tinged slab slid out. "Who wants to give it a try?" No one moved to pick up the bug. Regley, deciding leadership was more than giving orders, took the creature. He stared at the creature's solidified interior and gulped. He tentatively opened his mouth and took a bite. Then he felt the explosion of flavor wash over his tongue. In that moment, he knew exactly what Creeford was talking about when he spoke of the soul in the food. He was awash in the aromas and sensations as warmth filled his body. The soul of the food touched his own, and for the first time in months, Regley felt whole and happy. A small tear flowed down his eye when he chewed. "Do you think we can make this in bulk?" Regley asked. Creeford shrugged. "These critters love that protein powder. Hang a few bags over water by the trees and we'll be swimming in crawdads." The Wombus plan worked. The water teemed with thousands upon thousands of the crustaceans, so much so that they never seemed to run out. The new food, after some hesitation by the Jika to try it, ended up a success. The mood of the town dramatically improved. While they couldn't keep it up forever as a daily meal, Regley worked with Creeford to begin adding special meals throughout the week. Crawdad boils, beignet dessert days, and more from the various plants and creatures he scrounged out of the marsh. Once more, the revelation spread through the different kitchen camps as the relatively easy-to-transport spices made their way into standard shipments. While the road to getting the Jikas, a functioning member of the galactic community, was still long and arduous. At least disgusting food wouldn't be a barrier any longer, all because of Creeford and what he called his Cajun soul. Enjoy next story. Sergeant Deckrag sat in his modified drop pod, anxiously tapping his foot against the deck. The cavernous cargo hold of the bulk freighter was eerily silent. Normally, a ship this size would boast a crew complement of at least 60. Constant activity was a given with a typical 3-shift rotation common in shipping vessels of this size. Now, the hold was a quarter of its normal size. The forward bulkhead was stacked thick with a mixture of shrapnel, energy, and radiation shielding layers. It was designed to protect the occupants in the drop pods behind. The rest of the space was empty, save 5 drop pods, including the one Deckrag was occupying. He was blankly staring at his communication pad. The automatic screen sleep mode had kicked, and he was staring at his reflection in the surface. His light green scales and colorful head crest looked dull in the black. As a member of the Confederated Special Operations Command, CSOC, he was used to dangerous missions. Decreg and his squad had been on dangerous and outright insane missions during the now 7-month-long conflict with the Jikaw Democratic People's Republic, JDPR. Despite the name, the Jikaws were ruled by a hereditary dictatorial regime. They were currently on the 7th generation leader. The society operated on a 3-tier caste system. The top was solely occupied by the leader. The second tier was the military. The last tier was everyone else. The Confederation had, for the longest time, operated on the presumption that the Jikaw's formal name meant something. The Jikaws were an insular, flightless avian species. They didn't seek to join the Confederation after their first contact, and steadfastly refused outside access to their 3 systems. Outside contact with the Jikaw was rare. Trade was always performed by official JDPR merchants. They sold an array of low-grade machine goods while they preferred purchasing food and a few higher-order goods. The Jikaw merchants were always friendly and frequently spoke of how pleasant life was in the JDPR. The only other contact was with the rare, roving Jikaw pirate band. They preferred to operate out of hijacked ships and targeted valuable high-technology goods. Dekreg's younger sister, Degarla, was caught up in a raid of an exotic material production facility a few months before the war started. Jikaw traders were always apologetic when asked about it. They explained that the JDPR had such an effective law enforcement apparatus that it was near impossible to commit crime. Various dissenters and other shady individuals, they said, would flee to the stars to engage in their preferred profession. Confederate law enforcement struggled with finding out what the Jikaw pirates were doing with all their stolen goods. Across investigation efforts by many agencies and species, no one could find where the Jikaw were moving the goods. Nothing turned up on any of the black market channels officials monitored. Everything simply vanished. At least until 2 months before the start of the war, when a consumer goods factory opened a container of Jikaw machinery parts and found a dozen Jikaw hidden away inside. In stark contrast to the well-fed, well-dressed traders, the Jikaws in the container were dressed in ragged clothing and terribly malnourished. Since no one knew the Jikaw language, it took a month for the computer systems to come up with a translation protocol. Afterward, the Confederation learned the Jikaws were refugees who were part of a forced labor camp tasked to build massive planetary defense towers. They said the JDPR was planning on invading a neighboring star system to resolve food shortages. Due to central mismanagement of their agricultural sector, the refugees also provided details on the inner workings of the species. Their dictatorial nature, a fanatical military that was well cared for, and billions of grindingly poor slaves performing labor. The refugees were only able to escape during the confusion of a large labor transfer effort to retool their facility. From export machine goods to munitions manufacturing, they were also a single extended family. Had the family had attempted to escape alone, her entire family would have been executed. Despite the warning, no one in the council believed the Jikaw would invade. The council assumed the Jikaw were outgunned and outmanned, so it would be foolish to attack. They grossly miscalculated what a dying dictatorial society would do to ensure its survival. Then, a vast fleet appeared in a Confederate star system compatible with Jikaw physiology. The ships that appeared were far more advanced than the Jikaw had previously indicated. The Confederacy realized how they were able to field advanced weapon systems when their ships began using the same boarding and capture tactics the Jikaw pirates used. Intelligence determined that there were, in fact, no Jikaw pirates. They were JDPR military raids using Special Forces units. The fact that the JDPR were sending trained combat units to engage in piracy answered a few nagging questions to Craig had regarding his sister's ordeal aboard Particle Station Huntsville. How did a supposed ragged bunch of pirates successfully board and control a space station, particularly a station crewed by humans? The few tactics Degarla is able to relay indicated a force that knew how to identify and subdue humans when they were only armed with force sluggers. They deployed drawing tactics, sacrificial ploys, and created a barricaded choke point. Had her now husband not been a human able to take a few hits to the body, and had the mind to create a makeshift airburst bomb, his sister would no longer be among the living. Now the Confederacy was engaged in a drawn-out, bloody battle to retake the planet the Jikaws occupied. The Jikaw military was fanatical and showed little concern with losing soldiers. They threw bodies at the Confederacy by the millions. Worse, the Confederacy had no means of shutting down the logistics feeding the occupation. Logistics in a conflict was always paramount. Many militaries over history, across every species, found themselves on the losing end of a conflict because they forgot to secure a means to supply the combat force. Conflict was as much the soldiers firing at each other on the front as it was finding a way to starve those soldiers of food and munitions. In space, logistics became remarkably difficult to sever. It allowed even the most brazen military mind to maintain an effective battle. Planetside, cutting logistics was fairly simple. Find the paths material and fresh soldiers could take to reach the front and sever it. In space, this wasn't possible. Attempting to defend a single star system was a monumental effort since there weren't convenient choke points, only light years worth of open void a ship could slip through. Worse, subspace FTL allowed ships to appear in close proximity to the battle. While subspace inhibitors existed, trying to net more than a light minute beyond a planet was virtually impossible. The power requirements were too great beyond that point. Species that made it to space quickly learned to avoid engaging in organized armed conflict. Since battlefields were wide-open voids easily reinforced, conflicts were long and bloody by default. It no longer made sense to engage in open warfare since it quickly wore down both sides. A wide-open regulator produces a hot flame, but will also exhaust the fuel in the tank in short order. Even knowing this, the Confederacy wasn't stupid. A standing military was still maintained since the galaxy had multiple unaffiliated races and alliances. While they knew it was silly to go to war, the Confederacy also knew that didn't mean they could disarm. Having a military at all was the equivalent of weapons of mass destruction many pre-FTL species developed. Crippling a logistics chain therefore required subjugating an entire planet. This proved a major hurdle with the GCAWs. While military intelligence determined the GCAW war production system was shaky and would only require the loss of one planet's production to cripple their effort, doing so would be a monumental task. Since the GCAWs were so secretive, no one noticed they had built up their 3 planets into massive fortress worlds. Planetary defense towers had multiple overlapping fields of fire, and each of their worlds had a 1 light-minute subspace inhibitor net. The array was devious. Scout ships needed to travel well within the planetary weapon field of fire to locate the small inhibitor net node. Larger ships couldn't engage in hit-and-run orbital bombardments to address the tower. Attempting to destroy the towers outside the effective range of their weapons proved equally futile. In conjunction with the inhibitor net, the GCAW set up a projectile warning system. Any physical munitions capable of surviving atmospheric re-entry were intercepted by orbital platforms. The platforms were maneuverable and moved to avoid counter-battery attacks. Energy weapon attacks were useless in an orbital bombardment since the atmosphere dissipated the energy. All the while, GCAW transport ships would use the overlapping defense field just outside the subspace inhibitor field as cover to supply the war effort. There was little the Confederacy could do to their worlds other than stand in a pointless stalemate, wasting munitions on a target they couldn't crack. Cracking the net was the mission of Deckrag's squad. Military intelligence, when evaluating the data returned by a small scout ship on a suicide run, identified one weak point in the defensive tower network. While the network on the 3 planets could survive the loss of multiple towers due to the overlap, there was one weak point identified on the GCAW homeworld. Half of the GCAW home planet was a vast ocean which had only a single island roughly in the center. Here, the GCAW placed a single defense tower. It was the only spot in their network where, if the tower was lost, the planet would have an undefended spot where a fleet could insert. Once a fleet could breach this point, it could use the planet's gravity well to lob physical munitions over the horizon and destroy the remaining defense towers. The problem was reaching the tower. Distance attacks wouldn't work. The plan was to insert a small team and destroy the tower from the planet below. To do so, the Confederacy converted a cargo freighter into a troop delivery transport. The ship, stacked with layers of protective shielding, would be sacrificed to the planetary defense towers. Behind would sit the drop pods. The plan was to set the ship on course for atmospheric entry over the island where the tower was located. When the tower destroyed the ship, the pods inside behind the shielding in the cargo bay would be protected. The Special Forces squad would then hide in the debris as the momentum carried them the rest of the way. The GCAW wouldn't care since the debris would burn up in their atmosphere and would hopefully not notice 5 drop pods successfully making landfall on the island. The odds were low. Deckrag, however, recognized the need. The only alternative was a lengthy, protracted battle of attrition to see if Confederacy vessels could overwhelm the rate of fire of the defense towers. A 90% chance of 5 deaths was an acceptable calculation against the guaranteed deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Dekrag's finger rubbed against the dark surface of his tablet. Normally, he wouldn't have been this nervous. Yet, he had received news that changed his outlook on the future. He suddenly didn't want to be on the mission anymore. Yet, they were, in less than an hour, going to drop out of subspace into a field of deadly fire. The tap of boots on metal tore Dekrag out of his thoughts. He turned up and saw his commanding officer, First Lieutenant Daniel Gore, approaching. From the interior of the ship, the human's heavy footsteps betrayed the density hidden in his small frame. He walked crisply over to his drop pod situated ahead of Dekrag's and sat. He looked up and, with a small smile, spoke. "Hey, Dek. You ran out on us all of a sudden. Did you get bad news in the last mail call?" Dekrag shook his head. "Sorry, LT. It's not bad news per se. It's actually great news. It just suddenly changed my perspective on life." Daniel leaned back and crossed his arms. "I'm all ears if you want to talk about it. I can't have my sergeants mind a mess for this mission." "Sure thing, Lieutenant Dan," Dekrag said with a small smirk as he attempted to cheer himself up with a small joke. Daniel frowned. "I swear, I'm regretting showing y'all that movie." Dekrag chuckled. Daniel wasn't like the other LTs Dekrag met over his 15-year military career. While he was an academy grad, top of his class at that, the human was humble. He never disregarded the more experienced sergeant and took his job of getting his soldiers home from the mission. Dekrag sighed as he handed his tablet over to Daniel. "You see, LT, it's my sister Digarla. Well, turn that on and you'll know." Daniel took it. Damn it to hells, I have. A hard time pronouncing your names?" Dekrag laughed. "Yeah, your larynx isn't designed to handle the guttural hiss. Her husband just calls her Darla." "Darla, right. How is she doing?" Daniel asked. Dekrag only gestured to the tablet. Daniel activated the device and stared at the screen where he saw an ultrasound image. His face suddenly beamed in a big smile. "Well, I'll be. Congrats, Uncle Dek." Dekrag lowered his head and felt his crest flutter. It was a rare moment of embarrassment. I bet the news confirming humans and Sinapians are compatible is making its rounds too. Daniel continued, oblivious to Dekrag's embarrassment. "Nah," Dekrag replied. "Everyone knows about the weird convergent evolution effect. There aren't too many variations DNA can make to produce a species capable of space travel. We haven't even found an alternate to DNA, since it doesn't seem anything else is even capable of producing life. The effect ends up making us mostly the same where it counts. Any given species can successfully reproduce with about 70% of the other species out there. Even if you can't, a mixed-race child probably can via the other parent's contribution. It'll just get added to the list. Not that it matters much. Apart from the weird fetishes, we instinctively know if it'll work or not by finding the partner appealing." "It's still new to humans," Daniel said. "We've only been out in the galactic community for a century. We haven't managed to form that many mixed species pairings yet. I'm mostly curious what the kid will look like." Dekrag shrugged. "I do too. I just hope he doesn't end up with too much hair. That would look weird." Daniel's face suddenly turned serious as he tapped the tablet. "Is this what's bothering you?" Dekrag struggled to find his words as he processed the question. Before he could answer, the door leading to the rest of the ship opened and the boisterous noises of the rest of the squad echoed in the cargo hold. "Hey, Sergeant. Why'd you vanish on us?" Specialist Fuzili said. She was a canid-type species called a Berrigan and had gray fur with white tufts across the cheek. "Yeah, we were just getting to the best part. I love how that guy in the power armor keeps getting killed over and over again just to wake up getting kicked," Specialist Rohili added. "He was an avian-type species called a Roo. He had green and purple feathers to go along with his purple beak." "That's because you'd love to be woken up like that every day," Specialist Dahili said. She was a tall, lanky, light blue species, similar to humans called an Assylian, though they had a light covering of fur over their entire bodies. "Heya, Fusroda," Daniel called out with a chuckle. Dahili rolled her eyes. "Seriously, LT, what is it with humans and your obsession with pop culture references?" Daniel shrugged. "Command made it too easy when they assigned you 3 to my squad." "Sure thing, Lieutenant Dan," Rohili said back jokingly. Daniel groaned. "I deserved that. Anyway, I'm just talking to the sergeant here about his mail." "Please don't," Dekrag started. He knew it was a futile effort. "You see," Daniel continued, ignoring Dekrag, Sergeant Deckrag here is gonna be an uncle." "Hey, nice," Fusili shouted. "I think we should get him a gift to commemorate the occasion. Maybe one of those cloths he could throw over his shoulder for the spit-up?" Rohili suggested. "That's enough," Deckrag said. He felt his anxiety starting to build. "Oh, I think a chest-carrying harness," Dahili remarked. Deckrag's anxiety suddenly burst out as he roared. "I said stow it! Drop and give me 20! The three immediately snaped to attention, shouted, "Yes, Sergeant!" and dropped to give their push-ups. Daniel looked over at Deckrag with concern in his eyes. Deckrag knew special forces were looser with the regulations than normal military units. They routinely went into high-risk missions and had to build a deeper bond to adjust. Excessive rigidity was harmful to the cohesion of a small squad like theirs. After the three stood back up and entered a state of attention, Deckrag sighed. "At ease. Sorry for my outburst. This news isn't sitting with me well." The specialists each silently sat in their pods and looked at Deckrag. Daniel broke the silence. "Hey, we're here if you want to talk." Deckrag rubbed his hand over his crest. "This news. It bothered me. I know what we do is dangerous, and I made peace with that years ago when I signed up. However, now, when I saw that little life on that image there, it hit me. That's a little person that will only ever know his uncle from stories." The five sat in silence for some minutes as they allowed the gravity of Deckrag's words to absorb in their minds. "Look," Fusili said softly, "the way I see it is we all have each other's backs. We did some crazy stuff. Border skirmishes, pirate station raids, and we even took over a Jakal cruiser. We cover each other and we can come home. Besides," Dahili added, "the LT is a human. You know he's not one to be messed around with." "Hey now, don't elevate us that much," Daniel said. Then he smiled. "That said, I am a Tennessee boy who is the descendant of the great Alvin York. Everyone, even Deckrag, groaned at that." Deckrag, thankful for the distraction, spoke. "Not this again. Even if that was true, you're so far genetically distant that he'd be no more related than a random stranger." "Sounds like you need to hear the story again?" Daniel said. He tapped on the tablet a few times, and, with a low volume, the familiar lyrics to the bluegrass song Rocky Top started to play. Daniel then launched into the story about the man who, along with only 15 compatriots, managed to capture over 100 enemies. There was even a point where York had to charge a rapid-fire fortification. "I get it. You humans have something. Broken up top," Deckrag said, tapping his finger on his own skull for effect. Daniel opened up his mouth to respond when a beep sounded from his wrist. He looked down, and his face went serious. "Buckle up, boys and girls. We're about to exit FTL. See you planetside." Deckrag and Daniel ensured the three specialists were secured in their pods before Daniel checked Deckrag's. Deckrag was happy his LT took his job seriously. A lot of officers thought they were above it all. LT, on the other hand, was always the first into the fight and the last coming home. He was the one who risked not having a follow-up check to ensure his pod was properly sealed. The silence in the pod was stressful. Even though they had dropped out of FTL at the edge of the subspace inhibitor net, it would take a few minutes before the towers would respond. Then, it would take a minute or two more for the attack to reach the ship. Deckrag closed his eyes and took calming breaths. After a few minutes, his meditation was rudely interrupted by a thundering pulse echoing from outside the pod. The first munition slammed into the kinetic ship's kinetic shielding. Lights flickered after a second boom, indicating the energy shield had failed. A third boom, louder this time, echoed through the cargo hold as the layers of physical shielding warped. A railgun round impacted against the protective wall, protecting the pods. A final boom was accompanied by a loud crack. The protective shielding array spiderwebbed before his eyes. It was the last thing he saw before the lights winked out. As he sat in the dark, he felt the gravity field vanish and zero-G take over. The power core failed. The last sounds he heard was the whooshing of air as the atmosphere vented into the void. Deckrag prayed the GCAW defense towers recognized the compromised hull and cut power. If there were any additional follow-on attacks, he wouldn't hear it. No further action came. It would take a few hours for their ship to drift into the GCAW homeworld atmosphere. All the while, the pods had to remain radio silent. They couldn't talk to each other, and all transmissions of vital signatures was disabled. Deckrag couldn't even obtain a visual since the blast shield was lowered over the viewport. The long silence allowed worry to ply in Deckrag's mind. For all he knew, he was the lone survivor, drifting through space along with the 4 corpses of his squad To distract himself from the intrusive thoughts, Dekrag checked his systems. Pod integrity and life support were green. Orbital approach thrusters were operational. Navigation was good. Reverse landing thrusters were showing as functional. He then checked his weapons. His plasma bolter was secure and still powered. His grenade bandolier was good. His armor survived his sitting down and strapping in. Dekrag obsessively repeated the process over and over again to maintain his sanity. He heard small hisses from inside the pod as the thrusters adjusted the trajectory. They were nearing the planet and could safely maneuver to land on the target island. Rumbling and sound soon followed as the pod entered the atmosphere. When the rumbling subsided to the rushing of air, Dekrag flicked on his life support transponder. System. He sighed in relief when the other 4 came back as operational. This meant that everyone survived the trip. The force of the reverse landing thrusters pushed Dekrag in his seat as the pod slowed before subsiding at the pod gently set on the ground. He thanked the top brass for giving them a newer model, not one of those glorified bullets orbital droppers used. Dekrag quickly gathered his gear as the pod door hissed open. He saw his squad exiting, no worse for wear, in the bright light of a full moon. Peering to the sky, he saw the residual streaks of metal burning up on entry. LT made a few hand signs. Dekrag nodded and checked his wrist communicator for the local map. They didn't have much intel to go on, only a basic topographical map and the location of the tower the scout ship was able to capture before it was destroyed. These types of missions with blind parameters were what the special forces guys were trained for. They had to move quickly. It wouldn't take long for a patrol to arrive at the landing zone. Identifying a circular route, Dekrag gestured magnetic north and the squad quickly moved out. The island was forested, giving them plenty of cover as they carefully crept toward their objective. While there was urgency in their mission, the LT kept them moving at a slow pace. Getting caught would be far more disastrous than a delay. Over the 2-hour trek to the objective, the squad evaded 3 patrols. They clearly knew someone was present who shouldn't be there and were on high alert. The only saving grace was there was a lot of ground to cover, which gave the team plenty of openings to slip through. Special forces had to know when to fight and when to evade. They had to save their strength when storming the tower. Reaching the tower, the team stopped at the edge of a clearing and looked at the target through some tall underbrush. Dekrag didn't like what he was looking at. The WAP's defense tower was an array of large anti-capital ship plasma throwers and railguns. The tower was ringed by 6 short-range anti-air guns. Open areas were blocked by tank catchers, while the main road leading to the tower was covered by fortified infantry positions. "What do you think, Sarge?" LT asked. Dekrag looked around. "Not good. Our options are to sneak in behind the tank catchers and use them as cover. Problem is, that will be a running fight. Unfortunately, that's going to be easier than trying to storm down the main road." LT pointed to one side. "What about there?" Looking where Daniel was pointing, Dekrag noticed a thick power cable strung from a pole into the forest. "We should check that out." LT nodded and spun his finger over his head as he led them in the direction of the cable. 2 clicks into the forest, the squad came upon another clearing. This one was a power generation facility. The facility was ringed by a fence. A single road led into the facility guarded by a fortified station. While not undefended, the power station was a far easier target. If they took that out, the entire defensive array would go dark. "Idiots built their power generator way out here," whispered Fusili. Dahili peered around the space. "Based on the topography, I bet they ran out of room at the defense complex. This is the only flat space we've seen around here that can fit the generator." "Whatever it is, let's not look a gift horse in the mouth," LT replied. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" "Best option?" "We circle around and cut through the back fence. I don't know what they were thinking only guarding the road. It's better than trying to hide behind those tank catchers and attacking the fortification," Dekrag said. As LT opened his mouth to speak, a loud alarm whined. It was followed by a green bolt of plasma hurled their direction. LT cursed. "How did they spot us?" Not wasting time, the 5 rolled down into a small depression in the ground. Plasma bolts started to spit over their heads as more GCAW defenders began to fire on their position. A spotlight soon illuminated them. "Shit," the LT spat. "This isn't good." "We should pull back and regroup," Rohili suggested. "Not gonna work," LT said. "It's not like they're going to forget we exist and go back to a patrol route. If we don't take this place out now, hundreds of thousands will die cracking this nut open." "It's not like we can rush out there either," Fusili said as she held her head down. Taking his dog tags, LT used the back end as a mirror. He took a grenade off his bandolier and, with his crazy human strength, lobbed it from his prone position. Crying squawks rang out from the enemy beyond. The attack only briefly paused the shots, which resumed once more. "Give me your bandolier." "Deck," LT ordered. "I'll draw them to me. You four go around back while they're distracted." "Daniel, sir," Decrag started as he forgot mission protocol. "That's suicide." Daniel looked back over with a smile. "You forget I'm a human. They'll have a hard time hitting me at a full run, and I can take a few of those plasma rounds. They don't look calibrated to kill me with one shot." "No, I'll help out," Decrag said in a panic. "Sergeant, you have your orders," Daniel said in a cool, firm voice. Decrag sighed as he pulled off his bandolier and handed it to the LT. "Yes, sir." LT nodded and pulled another grenade. He lobbed it, and as the second the explosion went off, he ran for a tank catcher along the road. "Over here!" When the spotlight left the depression in the ground, Decrag and the others got up to sprint toward the rear of the power station. As they ran, the LT was raining explosive death upon the fortified guard station. The GCAW inside the fence were all running toward the battle, leaving the backside unguarded. The night was filled with explosions, cries of GCAWs getting shredded, the pulses of plasma rounds hissing through the air, and a strange high. Pitched battle cry from the LT, he was raining an entire platoon's worth of munitions on the enemy, all on his lonesome. Under the cover of the racket, Decrag used his plasma bolter to burn out an opening in the fence. Quickly identifying a back door, the four entered the facility. Moving in a clearing pattern, they hastily moved through a long hall, tossing grenades into side rooms without caring who or what was inside. They didn't have the time to validate combatants. Decrag would take the brunt of any punishment for violating the rules of war if it came to it. The squad then reached the main power core. The sound of fighting outside was beginning to wane. After chasing away a few haggard-looking technicians, Decrag pulled a pin in a grenade on a bandolier, taken from Rohili, and threw the entire thing at the main power core. Luckily, modern power generators didn't explode. They just fizzled out when their containment was breached. The grenades exploded, and the building's power winked out. A few low-red emergency lights operated by battery illuminated the room. Apart from a few distant screams of the fleeing technicians, everything went quiet. The squad carefully maneuvered their way to the front of the building and exited. Outside in the bright moonlight, Decrag saw carnage. GCAW bodies littered the ground. Some were torn apart in explosions, while others were burnt from plasma charges. Nothing was moving. There were even some with evidence of knife wounds leading into the fortified bunker at the entrance. Fear rose in Decrag's chest as he ordered his squad to move toward the bunker. At the entrance, he noticed a spent Confederate plasma rifle lying on the ground in muddy blood. A cold fear took over Decrag as they carefully entered the door. Inside was carnage. Feathers and blue-green blood. Mixed in were splashes of deep red. Then Decrag saw Daniel. He was sitting awkwardly against the side of the bunker just under the window in the moonlight. He was staring silently ahead, unmoving. "Secure this room. They'll be sending a force from the main defenses," Decrag ordered. "What about the LT?" Fuzili commented with a soft, shocked whisper. "No time for that now," Decrag snapped. He badly wanted to mourn, but there wasn't time for that now. He pulled out a transponder from his pack and pressed the button. The subspace signal will have notified the fleet the mission was a success. In minutes, the main fleet would be overhead, raining death on the other defensive fortifications. Minutes after that, they'd get their exfil. As the specialists got into position, Decrag kneeled next to Daniel. Death was unlike the films. No one ever got to sit up in a nice position. No one ever got to give their final words before breathing their last. There wasn't a nice sunrise to accompany the gravity of the event. All there was before him was the burnt, mangled body of his commanding officer and friend, staring blankly at nothing on the floor. Decrag reached down and closed the eyes. He knew that Daniel would not be left behind. Decrag wouldn't allow it. Peering over Daniel, Decrag saw the tablet. He picked it up and looked at the screen. While reality never matched the films, Decrag knew he could do one thing. Loading up the song list, he began playing Rocky Top on low volume. It wasn't a slow, somber song to go with the moment, but it was Daniel's favorite. Before taking up his position with his squad, he opened up the communication link and sent a reply to his sister. It was a single sentence. "If you're thinking about names, might I suggest, Daniel?" After hitting send, he hefted his plasma rifle to the rim of the bunker and aimed it down the road. He controlled his breath in the moonlight as streaks from ships entering orbit overhead grew in number. The invasion had started, and soon the war would end. They could honor the sacrifice of the fallen after it was all over. Daniel had given the greatest sacrifice, so Deckrag could go home to his family. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.